Hello, everyone. This is Gil Preuss, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. I want to thank you all for joining us online this evening. It's nice to see that even in these unusual times where so much is going on, we can still come together as a community for some learning and discussion. Before we move on, I would like to thank Rabbi Reen and Agudas Achrim congregation for originally offering to host this special program. We hope to be able to meet together in person there another time soon. I also want to introduce Jennifer Rasmus, the Washington, D.C. manager of the Shalom Hartman Institute, our partners for tonight's programs.
Thank you, Gil. The Shalom Hartman Institute is proud to be partnering tonight with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington on this important program. Thank you to the more than 300 people who are joining us now virtually. We will have time for a few questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, as you hear tonight's talk, we encourage you to send it to us by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Back to you, Gil.
Thank you, Jen. No doubt, we're all keeping a close eye on the coronavirus news here in Greater Washington, in Israel, and around the world. But hopefully, tonight will be an opportunity to switch gears and sink our teeth into a different topic. While not a pandemic, a topic that is of deep and ongoing importance to us all. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Arab-Israeli conflict. If you're like me, you're probably wondering, in the wake of elections, peace plans, health crises, and so on, where exactly do we stand? What hope is there for reaching a lasting peace agreement in the near future? On the one hand, a negotiated two-state solution seems more elusive than ever. And yet, on the other hand, I know that there are passionate and creative people working day in and day out to foster crucial understanding and pave the way for progress. One of those people is the renowned scholar and champion for hope, Yossi Klein Halevi, who is with us this evening. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. You likely also know him for his award-winning writing. In his books, Yossi is compassionate and determined in his efforts to show us just how much common ground there is between Jews and Palestinians. Thank you, Yossi, for signing on. I will note that it is 1 o'clock in the morning for Yossi, so we are especially grateful that he carved out the time to join us. We hope you and your family are staying well. Before we begin, I would also like to thank our partners at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and my Federation colleagues for all of their work on our lecture series. Finally, thank you all for tuning in. And now, Yossi, thank you.
Gil, thank you very much. And thank you, Jen, really for everything that you do, and specifically for this event. And good evening, everyone. This is really a memorable event for me. It is certainly the first public lecture that I've ever delivered at 1 in the morning, my time. And so thank you all for joining. And this is really, in some sense, a real moment for all of us. And it is, in some way, a doubly surreal moment in Israel because the country, as I'm sure many of you know, is under virtually complete lockdown. We were the first country to completely shut ourselves down. And at the same time, we have the political equivalent of lockdown. We don't have a really functioning government. And so our topic tonight seems a little bit abstract, even for me sitting here in Jerusalem. And yet I would argue that there have been some significant, perhaps even historic events just in the last few days that bear unpacking and that we really need to take note of. And so what I would like to do with you tonight is focus on Israel's relations with its neighbors in three contexts. one can think of this almost as three concentric circles. The innermost circle is our relationship with our fellow Israeli citizens who are Arab or Palestinian. The second circle is our relationship with Palestinians in the West Bank. And the final circle is our relationship with the Arab and Muslim worlds. And I'll address these issues in part from a personal perspective. I'll draw on some of the experiences that I've had since publishing my recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and in particular, how that has in some ways reshaped my thinking on the Palestinian issue. The latest news in our very complicated political melodrama is that it looks like the system is moving towards some form of unity government. And Netanyahu has called for a temporary unity government focusing on dealing with Corona. Gantz, the head of the Blue and White Party, tonight has affirmed his willingness to enter for the first time into a unity government, presumably under Netanyahu as prime minister. But he added a very significant clause, and that is that he is ready to enter into a unity government with all factions in the Knesset. Now, usually in the past, what that meant was all Jewish factions. And so Gantz was very specific in saying, I mean all factions, including the Arab United List. Now, in the last few days, there have been unprecedented negotiations between Blue and White and the Arab List, exploring the possibility of creating for the first time in Israel's history, a Jewish Arab government. That would be of limited duration. The Arab List would support the government from the outside. They wouldn't be actual members of the government. But nevertheless, the very fact that we've been exploring this possibility means that a psychological barrier has been broken. The deep ambivalence that exists here in terms of bringing in the Arab List into some relationship with the government is mutual. The ambivalence is shared by both the Jewish political system and by the four Arab parties that make up this coalition known as the Arab United List. And the ambivalence on the side of the Jewish parties is very straightforward. Over the years, many of the Arab Knesset members have expressed either open support or tacit support for terror attacks against Israeli Jews. Now, what most of the Arab Knesset members would say, and some of them are quite explicit in making this argument, is that in fighting against the occupation, Palestinians are morally permitted to attack Israeli soldiers, but not civilians. Now, that's a distinction that makes no moral sense, certainly no political sense, coming from a Knesset member who has sworn loyalty to the state of Israel. And so the notion that you could create a shared political arrangement, shared political space with Knesset members who support terror attacks against our kids in uniform is something that until this moment has really been anathema, virtually across the board for Israeli Jewish politics. Now, on the side of the Arab parties, the ambivalence has been no less pronounced. Because joining an Israeli government in one fashion or another means taking responsibility for Israel's security decisions. It means being in a position where if we need to retaliate against rocket attacks coming from Gaza or if we find ourselves in a conflict with Hezbollah, or if the Israeli Air Force attacks Iranian bases in Syria. All of those scenarios are certainly realistic. What do the Arab parties do if they are, in some sense, responsible to the government? And so neither side of the political divide has really wanted to probe the permeability of these, until now, quite rigid borders separating the Arab political system in Israel and the Jewish political system. Again, I would emphasize that there are very good political, ideological reasons for both sides being ambivalent. That has nothing to do with racism, which is not to say that there is not a serious problem with racism here. But in this particular case, I would argue that the political and ideological abyss between these two political forces have until now been so overwhelming that one didn't need racism to explain why the parties have not been able to come together. What has breached this abyss is the determination after 3 elections on the part of the centrist Blue and White Party to create a temporary situation where a government would be formed with support from the outside by the Arab list that would pass a law forbidding a prime minister to serve if he is under indictment, which of course refers only to one person now. And then the intention was either to go to new elections or to try to create a post-Netanyahu unity government with the Likud. Now the coronavirus has upended that plan, as it has upended so much else. But with this twist, Gantz has now committed himself to his new quasi-partnership with the Arab parties. And this puts the political system in a completely new situation. Now, I think that the reason that Gantz is insisting on bringing the Arab list into a wall-to-wall temporary coalition is because he wants to remove the stigma from Blue and White, which Netanyahu is trying to impose on Blue and White, of being, quote, collaborators with, quote, terrorist party. And so he's trying to, in a sense, implicate the entire Jewish political system in legitimizing the Arab list. But think for a moment what this means, what this moment actually means, the potential of this moment for transforming the relationship between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. Now, the relationship between our two communities is very complicated. And it's complicated because, in some sense, both the Jewish majority and the Arab minority are simultaneously minorities and majorities. We, the Jewish majority, are a minority in the region, and we're very conscious of being the lone non-Muslim, non-Arab state for thousands of kilometers around us. And the Arab minority is very conscious of simultaneously being a minority in a Jewish state with a very uncertain status that has the formal rights of equality, but does not, in fact, have equal government allocations, for example, other examples of inequality. And at the same time, the Arab minority is keenly aware of being part of a regional majority which is, of course, hostile to the Jewish majority in the country. And so Arabs and Jews move in and out of minority-majority psychological status, which has implications for how we relate to each other, because the Jewish majority is often very wary of the Arab minority, is openly questioning the loyalty of a community, which sends members, which sends to the Knesset representatives who will openly identify with Hezbollah, Hamas, to say nothing of the Palestinian Authority. And so the problem here, though, is that the Arab minority has proven in one poll after another for years now that a majority of the Arab sector is keenly interested in becoming part of the Israeli mainstream and identifies as Israeli. In fact, in one recent poll that was released by the Israel Democracy Institute, a majority of Arab Israelis, small majority, but nevertheless, answered affirmatively when asked, "Are you proud to be an Israeli?" Now, I find that extraordinary because think about the conditions in which Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis live live out their identities. They are part of a country that is occupying their people in the West Bank. They are part of a country that is not really sure how far to go in embracing and including this minority into its identity. We speak about Israeliness, but we often mean Israeliness as shorthand or interchangeable for Jewishness. And so the question that we're facing is, can we create a neutral civic space, an Israeli identity that can bring together Arabs and Jews without compromising on the basic Jewishness of the state? And that is really the crucial balancing act that I would say is at the heart of the challenge of Israeliness. My understanding of Israeli identity, the vexing question of Jewish state, democratic state, is the definition that I believe the founders of the state presented us with in the Declaration of Independence. And if you read the Declaration, or at least my reading of it, leads me to the following definition of Israel. Israel is the state of every Jew, whether or not he or she is a citizen of Israel, and it is the state of all of its citizens, whether or not he or she is a Jew. The state of all Jews, whether or not they are citizens, the state of all citizens, whether or not they are Jews. Now, the recent Jewish state law got it half right. When it declared the Jewish state as the nation state of the Jewish people, that is completely in harmony with the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. The problem was that the nation state law, in presenting a definition of the identity of the state, left out the other half of the equation, which is Israel as the nation state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. And so Blue and White has promised, and made that promise explicitly to the Arab list, that it would, if it would create a new government, it would amend, it would not cancel the Jewish state law, but it would amend the Jewish state law. And all it needs to do is add one little word. And that word in Hebrew is ve'ezracheha, and all of its citizens. In other words, Israel is the state of the Jewish people, ve'ezracheha. So that's where we stand at this fascinating moment, complicated moment. There is, again, deep ambivalence on both sides. How far do we really want to take this relationship? And no one is calling it an alliance. But there is now a public relationship of the center of the Israeli map, the center and the left, with the Arab political structure. Where that will take us to really depends on what the nature of this apparent unity government that's taking shape in the next days will go. But I believe that we will look back at this moment and realize that something historic has changed. Now, moving to the next circle of our relationship with the Arab world, the Palestinians. And there one can safely say that nothing has changed. And in all likelihood, nothing is going to change in the foreseeable future if we mean by change the chances for a two-state solution. There is no foreseeable breakthrough anytime soon. The Trump plan created a moment of what I would call a wake-up moment for both Israelis, and specifically the Israeli right, and for the Palestinian leadership. Even though the plan itself was stillborn and certainly nothing concrete will come from the plan. In fact, no one is even thinking about the plan anymore. But I found the plan to be significant in the following way. First of all, it presented the challenge to the Israeli right in the following way. The Trump administration is the most pro-Israeli right White House that we have ever seen. And yet, even the Trump administration, at the end of the day, came out for a two-state solution, which is anathema for the settlement movement. And while its plan did allow for all the settlements to remain in place, if you read the fine print, those settlements would remain stranded within a Palestinian state with very little room to grow. The settlement leaders understood what this meant for their future, and most of the settlement movement has been vehemently opposed to the Trump plan. That's something that's been missed by much of the international community. And what the settlement leaders understood was that they will not get their vision, their blueprint, their solution to this problem validated even by the most sympathetic American president. And so this is a moment when I believe the Israeli right understood just how deeply the international community has endorsed the two-state solution, just how much that two-state solution has become a part of the expectations of the international community. So that was the wake-up call for the Israeli right. Whether the Israeli right will read it as a wake-up call or not, don't hold your breath. The Palestinian leadership, same thing. They received a wake-up call, though there again, don't expect a real response. The wake-up call for the Palestinian leadership is this. Every time a proposal is placed on the table, every time there's a map put on the table, it is smaller than the offer that preceded it and which the Palestinian leadership rejected. The Palestinian national movement has been saying no to maps, to offers of a two-state solution, literally since 1937. 37, 47, UN partition, and then the Clinton proposals in December 2000. And if you look at the trajectory of those proposals, each time there was a Palestinian no, the next map shrunk until we finally come to the Trump proposal, which is the smallest map yet. Now, this moment should, in principle, call for some sort of reckoning within the Palestinian national movement. Here again, don't hold your breath. The Trump plan forced me to be engaged with in a way that I think I would not have in the past, in large measure because of my renewed involvement with Palestinian society, the result of this book that I published about 2 years ago. And that, when I say renewed involvement with Palestinian society, I had been deeply involved with Palestinians before the Second Intifada in the late 1990s. I spent a year going into Palestinian society on a journey into Palestinian Islam and Christianity, which became the basis of a book that I published in 2001 called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. And that was a spiritual journey into Palestinian Islam and Christianity, going into places of prayer, learning how to pray with Muslims, meditating with Christian monastics. And then the Second Intifada came. And like most Israelis, I concluded that there is no one to make peace with. And that was my position, as it remains the normative Israeli position for many years. I had concluded that after Israel accepted the Clinton proposals, accepted a two-state solution, and then experienced 4 years of suicide bombings, that the notion of a two-state solution anytime soon in our generation was really a fantasy. And so, like almost all Israeli Jews, I contracted into myself and decided not to waste my time on the Palestinian issue. What began to change for me was involvement in his program that we began at the Hartman Institute, called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, that brought Muslim American leaders to Jerusalem, to the Hartman, to the Machon, the Institute, to study Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. Really an extraordinary program that was initiated by my friend and partner, Imam Abdullah Antepli, who heads Muslim studies at Duke University. And we are now entering our 7th year, our 7th cohort. Over 100 leading young Muslim Americans, writers, journalists, university chaplains from Yale, Northwestern, Wesleyan, community leaders, activists have been part of this program. And they are now leading efforts on the local level all over the US and Canada to bring the Muslim and Jewish communities together. And what I learned from this program was really 2 things. The first was how to see this conflict again through Palestinian eyes, through Muslim eyes, the trauma, the pain, the anguish, and really being forced to reopen to my neighbors who are literally on the next hill from where I'm sitting now. And I felt that if I'm having these deep engagements with Muslim Americans, how is it possible that I'm so totally cut off from my Palestinian neighbors? And the second thing that this program did for me was give me a language, a way with which to speak about Israel and Zionism to Muslims. And to realize what it is that Muslims generally don't understand about Jewish identity. Kinds of things that we take for granted about ourselves. For example, the fact that we're not just a religion, but a people. This came as very big news for almost all the participants in our Muslim leadership program. And when we explained to them that you can be a Jew and an atheist and still be a Jew in good standing, depending who you ask, but relatively good standing. And this came as a major shock to our students. Because for Muslims, and for that matter for Christians, you can't be a Muslim and an atheist. You have to choose. As soon as you reject the most basic dogma, you're out. You're a post-Muslim. And so these were some of the issues that we unpacked with our students. The 4,000-year relationship of the Jewish people with this land. And we emphasize those issues. The web of relationship between religion, peoplehood, land, sovereignty. And we did not deal with the Holocaust in this program. We have them here in Jerusalem for a total of 1 month. It's a year-long program, most of which takes place in the US, but we have them for 2 weeks at the beginning of the program, 2 weeks at the end. And we don't take them to Yad Vashem. And we tell them at the beginning that's a deliberate decision because we are here to teach you a story about the Jewish attachment to Israel and the place of Israel and peoplehood in our national identity. And we're not here to deal with the Holocaust because the state of Israel is not primarily about the Holocaust. And this comes as a major shock again to our participants. But all of these elements, the centrality of peoplehood, the need for Muslims to understand that we're not just a religion, but a people with a land, and that state of Israel exists not because of the Holocaust or Western guilt for the Holocaust, but because of centrality of this land in our identity. All of those issues, all of those insights, what I tried to bring into this book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which was an attempt to explain to Palestinians and anyone in this region about who we are and why we came home and why we believe this is home. And so the purpose of the book really was twofold. One was to start this conversation over narrative. And the second was to invite my neighbors to respond. And the book, by the way, was translated into Arabic and offered for free downloading in Arabic. And it was published in Arabic online the same day it was released in the US in English. And that was, I felt, very important for the integrity of the book, of this project. And I decided that I would, first of all, I made the promise that I would answer any letter that I received from Palestinians, provided that it was written in a spirit of engagement, no matter how problematic the letter was. And I got more than my share of problematic responses. The good news was that I got hundreds of responses. The bad news was that many of them were as one would expect, responses that were not seeking engagement. But what did pleasantly surprise me was how many responses I did get that really were looking for a relationship. And so I recently published a new edition of the book, a paperback edition, with a 50-page epilogue, letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbors. And I'll tell you a story of one of those letters, and then a story of one of the letters that I received that is not in the book because it came out after the epilogue, after this new edition appeared. One day, about a year ago, a young man whom I did not know comes to visit me at my office at Hartman in Jerusalem. And he says to me, I read your book online in Arabic, and then I bought it in English. And I read it in English, and I realized that your translation in Arabic was terrible. And then he hands me 5 pages of Arabic, and he says, here's my translation. Here's a sample. If you think this is good, show it around. And then I will, I'll do the translation if you want. showed it around. People told me it was extraordinary. I hired him. He translated the book. He was not able to put his name on the translation because of fear of repercussions in his community. But I hired him to do social media outreach in Arabic, and the response has been tremendous. I'm getting responses from all over the Arab world. The book has been reviewed in Saudi Arabia's leading news weekly, a very good review. It's been reviewed in media in Morocco, in Egypt. And, but I'll tell you a story about a Palestinian letter writer who sends me an 8-page email. And he starts off by saying, congratulations on a very successful piece of propaganda. You and I, he writes, you and I both know that most of what you've written here is not true. And he proceeds to tell me that Abraham wasn't a Jew, he was a Muslim. There are no real Jewish roots in this land. We, in fact, are not really Jews, we are Khazars. And finally, he writes, don't mean to offend you, but certainly the description of the Holocaust in your book could not be realistic. It could not have happened the way that it did. And parenthetically, I should add that I do write about the Holocaust in the book, but at the very end of the book. And I make the point of telling my neighbor, I have not written about the Holocaust until now, but I need to explain something about the place of the Holocaust in our identity for you to understand who we are, who your neighbors are. And so, and then he signs, then he ends this letter by saying, and in conclusion, I would be delighted to get together with you and discuss these issues further. So I'm reading this letter and thinking, well, what do I do with this? And finally, I decided to write him back and invite him for lunch, because the letter was written as difficult as it was to read. It was actually written in a friendly way. And when I invited responses, I didn't qualify what kind of responses. He responded, and so I responded in return. We got together for lunch. He brought, it turns out that he works for the PA. He's a spokesperson for the PA. And he brought one of Mahmoud Abbas's advisors with him. I brought my son. And we had a very moving conversation. And at the end, he said to me, when I look into your eyes, I see a person of truth. And then he wrote me after the meeting saying I was the first Jew he had ever had a conversation with. And he could no longer think about these issues in quite the same way. And let's continue this conversation. Now, it's a small story. And this book is not going to bring peace. But what I think it does show is that we need to start having conversations that we haven't had before, specifically conversations about narrative. And the reason that I emphasize narrative is because I believe that this is not a conflict fundamentally about a line on a map, about refugees, Jerusalem, settlements. All of those are obviously crucial issues, but those are consequences of the conflict. They're not the root cause. The root cause are intangible issues: identity, memory, trauma, the right to define yourself as a people, the right to exist, existential fears. Those are the root causes of this conflict. And so what I'm trying to model in this book is a respectful disagreement over irreconcilable narratives. There is no way that we will agree, Palestinians and Israelis, about what happened and why in 1948, in 1967, about who is responsible for the collapse of the Oslo process, about what happened last week on the Gaza border. We disagree about everything in this conflict. What I'm hoping for, though, is to find partners on the Palestinian side who are ready to model a conversation with me based on the premise that there are two indigenous peoples in this land, and that whether we like it or not, we're going to have to accommodate each other's claims. And each side is going to have to contract its legitimate, from its perspective, its legitimate claim to the totality of this land. That's my premise. And I have found partners on the Palestinian side, more than I expected. I've toured American campuses with Palestinian partners. I've made a film just recently with one of my partners. And again, I'm not looking for large numbers. I don't need large numbers. I'm one person. But as a writer, I have a responsibility to try to create a language with which to speak about this conflict. And the language that I've tried to create here is, in a way, a combination of a left-wing and a right-wing sensibility. If you express empathy for Palestinian suffering, you are, quote, left-wing. If you defend the Zionist narrative without apology, you are, quote, right-wing in today's context. What I've done in this book is reach out to my Palestinian neighbor, empathize with Palestinian suffering, while upholding the integrity of the Zionist story and inviting the counter-narrative. And so this has really been an experiment. For me, a very powerful experiment. And an attempt to try to, maybe for myself, break the deadlock that I've been living with since the Second Intifada. Because I need to feel that I can breathe in this conflict. I need to feel that I have people on the other side who, when I hear news about what's happening in the West Bank, I have names and faces, and I have people that I care about. And it's a very small piece of this. But for me, it has really, in some ways, restored me. I would say, unfrozen me to start facing again the consequences of a long-term occupation of another people, which I consider to be a disaster for Israel. Now, at the same time, I'm not left-wing. The sensibility with which I wrote this book is very much coming out of that centrist place of bringing together left and right. And in the Palestinian case, bringing left and right together, a centrist approach to the Palestinians means the following. On the one hand, we must have a two-state solution for our sake as much as for the Palestinians. And on the other hand, we don't have partners on the Palestinian side for a two-state solution. We certainly don't have partners on the Israeli side, given the Netanyahu government, but there are other partners on my side. On the Palestinian side, within the Palestinian national movement, like almost all Israeli Jews, I don't believe we have partners. And so that makes me a centrist. And what I've tried to do in this book is give centrists a way of speaking about peace that sounds authentic to this moment and to our fears. Because so much of what passes for left-wing Jewish conversation on this conflict, especially in the diaspora, less here, is what it strikes an Israeli sensibility as being a little bit detached from reality, as if this conflict is happening on a South Pacific island and not in the most dangerous region on the planet, where Israel is surrounded by Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran. And what would it look like if we were to withdraw tomorrow from the West? What would happen there? So, in the end, this is a book that comes out of a very hard place, but it's an attempt to create a conversation from where we are at this moment in the conflict. Now, the final point that I'd like to address, and then we'll open for conversation, is the last outer circle of our relationship with the region, and that is the Arab world. The changes that are happening in the region are simply extraordinary. I mentioned earlier that Al Majalla, the Saudi news weekly, gave my book a favorable write-up. That would have been inconceivable even 2 years ago, that a leading Saudi newspaper would write favorably about a book defending communism. And I have been getting responses from Syrian refugees. A Saudi cleric wrote to me recently saying, I had no idea that the Jews are the descendants of the Hebrews. Well, of course you're part of this region. Of course you're indigenous. These kinds of responses. A couple months ago, 36 prominent figures from 15 countries in the Middle East convened in London and formed an organization called the Arab Council for Regional Integration. I've been involved with them a little bit behind the scenes. And this is an organization that is openly calling for normalization with Israel. For the first time, we now have a pan-Arab movement, and they are planning to take this to Washington. They are planning to take this to their capitals and to begin a social media campaign in Arabic. These are very serious people, very courageous people. And so what's happening obviously is being motivated in part by the growing Sunni Arab fear of an imperial Iran. Iran today effectively controls 4 Arab countries: Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So that's one reason why the Arab world is looking toward Israel and why there is this emerging strategic relationship with Israel. But there's another reason, which the Arab Council is really promoting, and which I am hearing from people who are writing to me from across the Arab world. And that is the growing realization in parts of the Arab world that the Arab obsession with Israel, the conspiracy theories, the hatred, the incitement, has only worked to undermine the stability of Arab societies themselves. This obsession with Israel, this 70-year war against the existence and legitimacy of Israel, has poisoned the Arab world. And so what I hear from the Arabs that I'm in contact with is we, the Arab world, need to free ourselves from this. The same way that I feel that we, Israelis, need to free ourselves from the occupation, they feel they need to free themselves from this war against us. And I believe that there is potentially a direct relationship between those two liberating processes. The more that we in Israel hear voices from within the Arab world ready to come to terms not just with the fact that we exist, but with our legitimacy. And that for me is the crucial words: legitimacy, legitimacy, legitimacy. The more that we hear an affirmation of our right to exist, the more that I believe Israelis are going to be willing to lower our guard and think once again about a process with the Palestinians. Now, I'm very pessimistic. In fact, I would say categorically, I don't believe there is any real chance of a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli agreement. Where there may be a chance is bringing the wider region in to oversee and in some sense guarantee a Palestinian-Israeli peace process. And the truth is that Palestinians have very little to offer Israel. They can promise us peace, and in the end, it's a piece of paper. The Arab world, on the other hand, has an awful lot to offer Israel. Normalization, economic relationships, military security. And so my hope is that we can begin a dynamic where this growing realization in the Arab world leads to the beginning of at least the first steps toward normalization, which in turn will prompt Israeli moves on the Palestinian front. And so that is the trade-off: peace with the Arab world for a Palestinian state. And because of this response that I've been getting from throughout the Arab world, I realized that I wrote this book for another audience as well. And that is the wider Middle East. And my hope here is that the next step, which is the book is now being readied for publication in Hebrew in Israel. My hope is that this book will trigger a new conversation among Israelis and provide us, those of us who are in the center, with a more nuanced language when speaking about peace with the Palestinians that is not left-wing, but is a language that those of us who realize that we desperately need a two-state solution, that's a language that we can adopt from the center. So let's open up for conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Yossi, for that really enlightening and honest talk. I just want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please do press that button and send in questions that you would like us to ask Yossi. And Gil, would you like to start us off?
So we received several questions, but I'd like to start with one, which was, out of all the responses that you got, which one made you think the most, kind of took you back into like whether thinking about your perspective or your approach? It's easy to think about those that were attacking, but what about made you reflect back on where you started?
Great question. Let me read you an excerpt from that letter. This is the last letter. I chose this as the last letter in the epilogue. And it's written jointly by a young Palestinian woman and a young Israeli man who met in Washington, D.C. and became friendly. And they read the book, both of them, and decided to write me. I didn't know them until I got this letter. I know them now, and we're working together. So, dear Yossi, we are a Palestinian girl from Nablus and an Israeli boy from Jerusalem who met in Washington, D.C. during a program at American University. We're writing to tell you about the work we've begun together. We were inspired by the method you used in your book to reach out to the other side. Your dialogue modeled for us a sincere and unpretentious way of speaking. I'm just reading excerpts here, so I'm skipping. your book showed us how to develop this method of encounter. We want these encounters to spread not only between Israelis and Palestinians living in the US and other Western countries, but also to bring our approach to Israel and Palestine. As a result of your book, we decided to travel to campuses across the US and tell our very different stories alongside one another to students. This book brought us together to create a serious dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis in their 20s. We are the next generation that will be responsible for handling the consequences of the failures of the generation of Oslo, who today cannot let go of their preconceived notions of the other, especially the notion that the other is the only obstacle for moving forward. We have no option except to create a new story. Now, I have to tell you that when I got this letter, I realized, oh, wow, I now have to own this book. It's real. Until that letter, there was for me still something abstract about this. I wrote this letter to my neighbors. I got some responses. It was interesting. It was complicated. Sometimes it was moving. But this book just changed the lives of these two young people. And I felt after that I have no choice but to fully commit myself to this process that I started without any idea of where it was going to lead. And so I am now all in, and in a way that I don't think I realized I would be when I wrote the book. So in that sense, this process has also changed my life.
Thank you, Yossi. We're getting a bunch of questions asking how representative are the centrist views that you're putting forth, both on the Israeli side and on the Arab-Israeli side, and also Palestinian side, Arab world. There's just a lot of questions about the representation.
Great question. On the Israeli side, I would say that I am part of a very large camp. In the last elections, we were the largest party. Blue and White came out as the largest. In this election, we slipped a bit, but I feel very comfortable in saying that the sensibility with which I wrote this book is shared by very large numbers of Israelis, including I would say, many soft right Likud voters who, if they believed if they believed there really was a chance for an agreement, might support it. On the Palestinian side, no, I recently saw a poll showing that a majority of Palestinians believe that the most important objective of the Palestinian national movement in the coming years needs to be the reclamation of all of historic Palestine from the river to the sea. That's a majority. And that didn't surprise me, because that's my working assumption, is that a majority of Palestinians do believe that not only does all the land belong to them in principle, but that is the active political goal of the Palestinian national movement. And that's something that I've taken for granted since the Second Intifada. What I've learned in my experience in not only meeting those who responded to me, because that's obviously a self-selecting audience, but I've had meetings with Palestinians in the West Bank. I've been invited to meet with groups. I've had very off-the-record meetings with people. And my feeling is that there is a minority, maybe even a large minority, of Palestinians who are truly ready for not just a technical two-state solution, but to accept the spirit of a two-state solution, with soul of a two-state solution, which is the premise that there are two indigenous people here. So you can look at that as good news or bad news. The bad news is that a majority of Palestinians probably still reject the legitimacy of Israel. In fact, I take that, again, I take that for granted. But the cautious good news is that I think there is a constituency among Palestinians for a genuine process of reconciliation. And I'm not really capable as a mainstream centrist Israeli of being any more optimistic than that.
So you wrote the book initially in English and then in Arabic, but the conversation needs to occur between Israelis and Palestinians. I know it's now being translated into Hebrew. One, why the delay in translating into Hebrew if that is the core of where the conversation needs to take place, which is one part, and then connected is as you see the need for greater conversation between the two parties and discussions of narrative, how do you expand that between you, Yossi, Klein, Halevi, talking and meeting with individuals to a much larger conversation to actually achieve change?
So in terms of the first question, I was waiting till I had Palestinian responses. And once this new edition came out, I felt ready to go with the Hebrew. There were some delays in the translation process. My Hebrew is good enough to know when someone else's translation is good or not, but not good enough to actually do a literary translation myself. So that also created delays. And I'm in this for the long term. And so if there's a half a year delay or whatever it is, that really didn't concern me. And in some sense, I would say that I was also relieved to be dealing with this book in stages, dealing with this book in terms of promoting the book in the US. I'm trying to sell the book. It's been very important for me to have young people especially, and young American Jews in particular, reading the book. So I've invested a lot of time on campuses. And the next stage for me was getting into Palestinian society. And the final stage really will be going into Israeli society. In terms of maximizing the impact, I don't know. You know, I'm not a political activist. I'm not a politician. I'm a writer. A writer is by nature a very private person. You know, the prospect of being quarantined because of Corona doesn't faze me in the least. I actually would look forward to being confined to my room, so that I don't have to apologize for not seeing anybody. I could actually sit and write, which is amazing. So I don't know how to answer that question, in all honesty. I'd be very happy to partner with people who do know how to do that. I'm hoping that the book will be taken up by others. There was a woman who got in touch with me recently from an very interesting Israeli movement called Women Wage Peace, which is an attempt to draw on all parts of Israeli society, not just the Tel Aviv secular left, but to actually approach Mizrahim, religious Jews, settlers, and they do have women from settlements as part of this movement. And that's a movement where I could see really having a relationship with. So I'm look, you know, I put this out, and I'm ready to to go where the book takes me. And I'm not a leader in that sense, but I'm ready to follow the book.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know you spoke about the traumas that both people have experienced, and you've talked about your own going through realizing that there's been 4 years of suicide bombing. We've got some questions where people were interested in hearing what happened in that dialogue when you had those dialogues. What was the Palestinian reaction if you were able to tell them about some of those traumas, and what, from a personal perspective, was your reaction if and when you heard some of theirs?
Palestinians tend to be really surprised when they hear about Israeli trauma. Many of them don't quite believe it. And I remember I had one meeting with young Palestinians, and I said to them, you know, your side has psychological power over Israelis. And they were shocked. They see themselves as completely powerless, which of course it basically are. But I said, you have psychological power of granting us legitimacy. Not that I need legitimacy from you to know that I exist and that I have the right to be here. But our legitimacy in the Arab world, and to some extent in the international community, does depend on the Palestinians granting us legitimacy. And that gives you an enormous psychological edge over Israelis, because what we need most desperately at the end of this conflict is the affirmation of our right to exist. I would say that the deepest Jewish wound coming out of our history, and especially out of the 20th century, was the sense that we can't take our right to exist for granted. And what this conflict perpetuated was exactly that wound. Where the Arab world and the Palestinian national movement pressed on our deepest wound was in denying our right to exist, denying our legitimacy, which was what we most needed an affirmation of after the Holocaust. And so you, Palestinians, have this key. You really have something that we desperately need. And this really, that came as a tremendous shock to them. I don't know what people will do with that information, but it was interesting for me to realize just how little we understand about the other psyche. And so much of the work that I'm trying to do here is really unpack the mind of Israel, the Jewish mindset, and asking Palestinians to tell us their mindset. Because in the end, if we ever do go back to the negotiating table, we are going to need, sitting around that table, psychologists, rabbis, imams, theologians, social workers. You know, that's really what this process, historians, that's what we need. So I hope that's useful.
Thank you. There were several questions looking at the parties that either are in power or more on the extremes, whether Israeli government or in Arab countries. So in Arab countries, the continued teachings about Israel and needing to destroy it, and anti-Semitism within Israel, perhaps, leadership that is against the two-state solution or other things, and against thinking about other narratives. How can this approach, or do you feel any sense of hope or optimism that the narratives themselves can, through the conversation, can overtake some of the larger contexts in which they operate right now?
You know, I use the Saudi media as a barometer because up until recently, the Saudi media might have been the most anti-Semitic media in the world. There's stiff competition. I'm thinking of the Egyptian media, the Turkish media increasingly, or large parts of it. But the Saudi media had a special place in the demonization of Jewish people. And now we are seeing real cracks in that wall of demonization. So the question is, how do we widen those cracks? How do we support efforts to counter the delegitimization narrative, which has been taking root in the Arab world for the better part of a century? It's going to take a lot of effort to counter that. And what I've done is just really a drop in this effort. But I think, again, that it is a useful model for what can be done. Now, I'll give you some other examples of efforts that are now being promoted. A friend of mine, Linda Menuhin, who works at the Israeli Foreign Ministry, is an Iraqi-born Jew who fled Iraq relatively late, in 1970. She runs a foreign ministry Facebook page in Arabic that has something like 1.5 million responses. And she has, in Iraq alone, she has 300,000 people who are actively engaged in her page. And I said, how many are favorable? She said about 90%. So something is happening. We forget that the Middle East has gone through a trauma that is unprecedented for this region in the modern era. Syria alone, over a million casualties, millions of refugees. These are no longer functional countries. And so there is an opening in the Arab world, less so on the Palestinian side for obvious reasons, but the opening on the Arab world is there, and we need to be promoting it. One of the frustrations that I have is that the Jewish world is not yet placing outreach to the Arab and Muslim worlds at the top of its agenda. This should be our top foreign policy agenda. What Jewish-Christian relations were in the 20th century, Muslim-Jewish relations need to be in this. And that will require a great deal of thinking, of strategic planning, and of creative efforts. And we need multiple efforts along the lines of what Hartman is doing with the Muslim Leadership Initiative and what Linda is doing at the Foreign Ministry.
Great, thank you, Yossi. I'm wondering if your experience in writing this book, and also I know that you said you've brought this to campus a lot, there's a bunch of other divides happening in the Jewish community, whether it's from the right and the left, whether it's generational, whether it's American Jews in Israel. Has this book shown you anything that can be a model for those other divides that we're experiencing?
So one of the questions that I had to deal with when I began getting letters from Palestinians, decided that I'm going to publish them as an epilogue, was, do I respond to those letters in the book? And I made the decision not to. Of course, I've responded personally to every letter writer, and we have in many cases, we've had a lively correspondence. But I made a decision to give the Palestinians the last word in the book, which is to say, giving the counter narrative in a book that was written to defend our story, to give Palestinians the last word. And that was intended to honor them and to empower them. I spoke recently in Cincinnati, and a woman stands up and says, I'm a Palestinian American. I read your book, the first edition, without letters, and I came here with 6 pages of questions and challenges to you. And she pulls out the 6 pages. And I wrote these questions before I knew that you had published the Palestinian letters as the last word in your book. And she said, I have no questions for you. And that was such a powerful affirmation for me of what happens when you honor your political or ideological opponent, when you give space for the counter narrative. And I would argue that that approach applies in almost any of our conflicts. And my starting point is that my political opponent is not necessarily my enemy, or maybe is my enemy now, but may not be my enemy. And the story that I told you a little while ago about the guy who wrote me that long letter of denying the entire Jewish narrative, culminating in Holocaust denial, that for me is really, in some sense, a model of what can happen when you begin a process of deep, respectful disagreement. Now, that process is based on 2 things. The first is coming from a place in yourself of self-confidence in your story. No apology for my story. I'm not the criminal in the story. I affirm, I deeply affirm my story. I love my story, and I'm proud of my story. But the second stage is, I want to hear your story, as painful as it is for me. And in the same way that I've asked you to read my book, I'm going to read your narrative. I'm going to listen to your story. And then we'll figure out what we do with this. But we're going to start a process of listening to each other's stories.
So this is a last question. When you speak to a lot of Israelis and people have asked, they may say that they're not optimistic about peace in their lifetimes. And I guess the question, given all this, given the challenges, given the different narratives, given where we are today, have your experiences over the past couple of years made you more optimistic that we can actually get there, or is this the beginning of a many-decade, perhaps many-generation conversation in order to actually achieve some level of peace in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors?
So before I answer that question, I just want to go back, Jen, to the question that you just asked me, and just add one, what I feel is for me, a very important point. And that is that when I speak about, when I say that I'm ready to listen to the narrative of the other side, that's not just being nice. It's in my self-interest, because I want the Arab world to hear the Zionist narrative. And the only way the Arab world is ever going to hear my narrative is if I'm ready to also hear the counter narrative. So that's a question, really, of creating a momentum in which my story, which has not been heard for 100 years, has not been given voice for 100 years in this region, now has a chance of being heard. It is, frankly, it is a strategy of self-interest, and I own that fully. It is not it's not Brotherhood Week. It's not, we're all human beings. We all have the same concerns for our family. It's not that. it's taking this to a much edgier place. So I just really want to make that clear. In terms of your question, Gil, am I optimistic? I have to give you an Israeli answer. It's never about optimism. It's about dealing with whatever challenge you're facing. And it's taking one step at a time. Now, what I really believe we're facing in the Middle East is simultaneously war and the possibility of peace. Up until Corona took over the apocalyptic Israeli conversation, we were having another apocalyptic conversation here. A conversation which the army, the security apparatus has been trying to get Israelis to face for the last few years, which is the almost certainty that we are going to find ourselves in a conflict, in a regional conflict, sometime soon, with Hezbollah, Hamas, and probably Iran. Now that's one side of it, and I feel that there's that again, the chances of that conflict erupting within the next year or two are very high. So that makes me a pessimist by normal standards. At the same time, I look at what's happening as a direct result of the rise of Iran and the threat of war, what's happening with Israel's relations with the Sunni world. And so that makes me, again, by conventional terms, an optimist. But to deal with the prospects of simultaneous war and reconciliation, I think really in a way sums up the ongoing Israeli dilemma. For me, the essence of the Israeli experience is dealing with contradiction. It's dealing with paradox. Whether it's Israel as a secular state and with a strong religious overlay, whether it's dealing with populations that come from East and West, whether it's dealing with Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, all of the contradictions that the ingathering of the Jewish people here have brought, the conflicts between democratic norms and overriding security considerations, all of those issues. We are, by definition, a society of contradictions. And so our prospects veer wildly from war, possibility of regional war, to regional peace. And what our strengths are as a society is our ability to not ask the questions of what is going to happen 50 years from now, or for that matter, realistically, even a year from now. Because quite honestly, anything can happen at any time. And when I look at how Israeli society is handling Corona, this is, we have a very weak political structure and a very strong society. And this is a society that's used to responding to emergency with a high degree of social solidarity. We are a society that often acts as a dysfunctional family until we need to act as a functional family. And so we will take this one step at a time. And I can't allow myself to ask that question of, am I optimistic or not? I have a series of challenges, formidable challenges. I have to do what I can as an individual and hope that we'll have a government that will be, in some sense, more receptive to the possibilities than we've had before. And in the end, I still have a very deep trust in the basic wisdom and ability to cope of
Great. Thank you so much, Yossi, for this incredible talk. You told us a story about a letter writer seeing you and saying, I see a person of truth. I think you really do model for all of us how you can hold your truth and still listen and learn from so many others. So thank you so much. To all of our listeners, thank you for participating. We will be sending out this video to everyone who registered, a recording of the video, and we hope that you join us for future programs. Wishing everyone the best during this time. Thank you again.
Yes. Good luck to all of you, to all of us.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.